Estás viendo la versión para YouTube de Sí, el podcast de Somos Innovación. Acompáñanos a explorar cómo a través de soluciones innovadoras los latinoamericanos vamos a mejorar nuestras vidas. El futuro llama.
Hola, soy Federico Fernández. Bienvenidos a un nuevo episodio de Sí, el podcast de Somos Innovación. Hoy vamos a conversar respecto de una tecnología legislativa, podríamos decir, llamada Sandbox Regulatorio y del impacto positivo que puede tener para promover tanto la innovación como la creatividad humana. Y para ello nos acompaña Michael Meléndez. Michael es Vicepresidente Ejecutivo de Libertas, un think tank con base en Utah, Estados Unidos. Allí supervisa las operaciones que incluyen el análisis de políticas, los asuntos gubernamentales y la estrategia organizativa. Pueden encontrar a Michael en LinkedIn y Twitter. A ambos voy a dejar los links en la descripción del episodio. De ahora en más vamos a cambiar a inglés, así que bueno, espero que nos sigan escuchando en inglés. Michael, welcome to See.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you. It was, when I heard about your last name, I had the hope that you would speak Spanish as well. Maybe next time.
Well, you and my mother was born in Colombia, and my dad is half Mexican, and I was a troubled youth. How's that?
I mean, you're 3/4 Latin. You should. Well, anyway, no, but.
Un poquito, pero no mucho.
That's great. And really, again, thank you very much for giving us your time for this interview. Of course, I want to talk about this major success you have had in Utah. But before that, in talking about, let's say, the Libertas Institute, where you're executive vice president, I saw that the motto of the Libertas Institute is changing hearts, minds, and laws. Why those three, and how do you do that?
Well, I would say it kind of has to do with looking at the whole landscape of our society. And a lot of times that has to do with time periods and how long that takes. If you want to change a law, you can just do that, wait for the next legislative session and change a law. Great, that's cool. But did you change the minds and the hearts of the general populace? So for us, if you want to change the mind, you have to change the heart a lot of the time. So a lot of our work is future focused. Educating the children of the future, educating folks to rethink how they look at different public policies, and that is what's going to create the change that we'd like to see in our society for generations to come. The way to the mind is through the heart, through storytelling and helping these policies really come to life on how they actually impact folks.
Yeah, indeed, I agree, and in a few minutes we'll get to the project, this comprehensive sandbox, regulatory sandbox that you have achieved in Utah. But before that, and to enter, let's say, into the conversation. What would you say? Many people, I'm sure there are many people who believe that regulation, let's say, is not an evil. On the contrary, it's something great. It's something that helps, protect us from, evildoers, wrong, bad businessmen and things like that. How and why regulation can become something that makes more harm than good? What cases can you describe? Particularly, I know about one in particular that was instrumental in order for what you did in Utah. And let's say, and what are the dangers of over-regulation, and when regulation can become something that it's dangerous to creativity, to innovation, and to the civil society?
Yeah, well, I think that's the public policy space in general, right? We have a lot of good ideas and good intentions, and then get misused at some point, and too much of a good thing can be bad. And so it kind of goes back to what's the point of regulation? And for us, it has to do with the health and safety of the consumer. That's why we have regulations. And the other thing I would throw in there is we're concerned about financial fraud as well within that. And so a lot of times people just look to protect any kind of thing that might come up at some point, and that just isn't good enough. We operate in a society based on risk assessment, right? You get into your car and you drive, or you get into a taxi and you go somewhere, and yeah, you could become injured, you could even die in a car, but we take the risks to go out and live our lives and do certain things. So regulation is about looking at what is a high risk scenario. you know when we're dealing with food, obviously there's a lot of risks there, so we should have some baseline regulations. When we're building something, there's risk there. If we just let builders do whatever that they want to do, we don't want buildings falling down all over the place. There's risks. We can go back to the car example. If someone's building a car, there's safety regulations there. There's risks. Now, the problem that happens is when one of the general problems that happens is when companies use regulation to basically price out their competitors. And so an example of this would be, basically the prime example that happens all the time is if you as a company have some kind of standard that you are using and some kind of process, and you think it's great, and you probably use it in your advertising, and it's why people should come to your company. But then you use that process, that standard, that elevated standard, to lobby the government to make it a standard for everyone. And then it becomes too high of a cost for your competitor to even comply, that they basically have to shut down, or they have to change their price structure. Maybe they offer a cheaper alternative that isn't as high quality, and now they no longer can do that, and they have to either be equal with your pricing or even a higher price. And so that's why companies a lot of times have a big interest in regulation in order to move competitors out of the market. Or the other big thing is to prevent people from coming into the market. Anytime we have a highly regulated industry, it's really hard to get in. And I'll go back to a specific example, right? When we're dealing with a lot of financial things like insurance or other stuff like that, I mean, you've got to put up a lot of money in order to even open for business, whether it be, through bonds or insuring what you're doing with some kind of other insurance. Like it becomes very expensive. And this goes back to the example that we use since you brought it up. There was a gentleman here in Utah who was thinking, he's a mechanic and has worked for dealerships in the past. And so he understands how extended warranties work. And, here in the States, people are always getting text messages and phone calls about renew your extended warranty or buy an and a lot of it is a scam. It's a way to get people to pay additional money for a service contract that is written in such a way that it'll never actually be, you can't actually use it. And so he thought, well, actually an extended warranty is a good idea. I think people, if their transmission goes out, their engine, these big items that would be detrimental to someone to have to basically replace the vehicle or that part, an extended warranty would actually be useful. That's why people even buy into it in the first place. So his thought process was, what if I had a company that actually provided a good service when it came to extended warranties? And the way that we would fund it would be using it's a model used here in the States, which is called a healthcare sharing ministries. Rather than traditional health insurance, people pool their money together. They pool their resources so that when people need healthcare, they're able to reach into the pool and they're able to get different stuff. And so you reach this critical mass where people are helping each other at a much lower cost than traditional insurance. So he was thinking, well, I'll use this with extended warranties. People could pay a little bit each month and they could be covered if they needed help with some of these big expenses. And so he operated for about a year with no problem. He even went to the regulators and said, hey, what do you think about this? And it's like, oh, that's not insurance. That's not, you're fine. Go about your business. But eventually he got popular, and started to have customers. And so what happened was some of his competitors, some of the dealerships found out about it, and they issued anonymous complaints to the insurance commission. And so the insurance commission came back and said, hey, that you're an insurance company. You need to do all this stuff to comply. And so it was just too expensive for him to comply. So he had to just shut down, and he lost all his life savings. And he took care of everybody, made sure that everybody was paid out who paid into this program, but he lost his business.
Yeah, no, this is a very, let's say, this is a very motivating story for doing what you did. When you were talking earlier about big companies, let's say, trying to impose their standards to everyone else, the classical like regulatory capture, it came to my mind. It's not exactly the same, but like every time I buy the Economist magazine, there's a full page advertisement of Facebook asking for internet regulation. And I'm always thinking, this is probably not for our benefit.
Yeah, see that, it extends to a lot of different industries. That's the primary thing that people forget when it comes to regulating social media companies. It's like they want to clamp down on the big tech companies, but the reality is the more regulation you introduce, the easier you make it for the big companies to continue to have monopolies in the system. You make it that much harder for others to come in. You raise the barriers to entry for that market.
Yeah. Michael, we were talking before starting our recorded conversation, that probably the idea of a regulatory sandbox, unfortunately, in Latin America is not that common. It's in a way also, let's say, regulatory sandbox are relatively a novelty. I think like the first one, if I remember correctly, was implemented, I think, in the United Kingdom, like in 2015 or 16 for trying, for the fintech industry. So it's something relatively new, and unfortunately not that well known in Latin America. So if you had to explain it to an 8-year-old boy or girl, how would you describe a regulatory sandbox? What does it do, and why they can be so helpful, let's say?
Well, if we're going to get simple, then I would go back to, well, why is it called a sandbox? And I would use two examples. The first one is very physical, and that is, when the Wright brothers were trying to figure out how to fly their airplanes back in over 100 years ago, they did it on the beaches of North Carolina. They were in a big sandbox, and you can imagine the reason for that, right? They're coming up and down and crashing, and so a big beach of sand would be a lot easier to crash into, a big sandbox. It's the reason why a lot of these playgrounds, use sand. If you fell off the jungle gym, you fall into sand. It's a protective environment. It's almost it's a place where you can test, right? That's what the Wright brothers were doing with their flying machines. They were testing. So that term has carried over into the tech world. When a coder is developing a new program, a new software, they often use sandbox environments where they test out their code before they actually release it, to everyone, and actually publish it, and it has real world consequences. So sandboxes have historically been used as these testing environments, safe spaces for innovation. So that's why we have these regulatory sandboxes. So the idea is, how do we create a legal regulatory space where we can have a protective environment, where we can test new products, new services, new business models? And the idea here is that the regulator is the one who has defined and created this sandbox. The idea being that regulators, they do have a very kind of strict setting that they operate in. They have statutes, they have regulations, and so the question for them is usually yes or no. Either you fit or you don't. Like there's really no in between there. And so the idea behind a sandbox is, well, let's introduce maybe. So for a year or two, a company can operate within the sandbox. Maybe they have a limit on how many customers they have, or maybe there's a geographic limit on where they're operating. Regardless, they work hand in hand with the regulator to temporarily suspend some of these regulations and to study it out, try it out. Let's see what happens here. And there's transparency. Consumers would understand what they're getting themselves into, what's going on. And after the year or two, the idea is that regulators and these committees would go back to the legislative bodies and say, hey, this worked, or no, this didn't. We don't really need this regulation, or we should tweak it this way, or we need less, or whatever it might be, to give those recommendations so that we could actually have long-term change. The other idea is, this is open to everyone. If someone comes in and wants to use the sandbox for a specific idea, then any company could come in and use it for that idea. If we're doing something with rental cars and getting rid of some kind of regulation, then every rental car company could participate. The idea is not to pick winners and losers. It's to challenge innovators to go out and give it a crack.
And in that sense, related to the last you've said, I think that is, let's say, the most. And now we'll go to the project you made approved by the legislators of Utah for a comprehensive regulatory sandbox. And I think that is like the key issue of what you have achieved and why it's so great. And almost revolutionary, because in many places, I mean, not that many, but in several places, you have sandboxes, you have some sort of, or an easier regulatory framework for a certain industry or a center or a certain economic sector or productive sector. But in your case, well, as the title says, it's a comprehensive sandbox. So And please feel free to talk as much as you want. I would really like us to tell you about the project you had for Utah. How was the process to get it done? If I remember correctly, it's been approved with bipartisan support, which really says a lot of what you have achieved. So please tell us about the Sandbox project that Libertas got approved in Utah.
Sure. Well, you referred to kind of the beginning of all this. The UK established a sandbox back in 2014, and the whole world started to kind of gravitate to that, and we noticed, and we saw that other countries like South Korea and Japan and others were considering to do more than financial technology, but to actually try to do something more comprehensive. And you had in the UK, you had additional sandboxes in terms of privacy and other things that came out. And so we're like, well, if we're going to get a comprehensive sandbox in Utah, we've got to start somewhere. So we started with financial technology. The Arizona had already done it, and so we followed suit. They'd done that. Some other states had done insurance technology, and insurance in general. That's another thing I should clarify. This isn't just for technology. It's for any sort of idea. But anyway, so we did insurance, and then the courts in Utah, they pursued a legal services sandbox. So Utah had 3 sandboxes up and running, and legislators had become comfortable with this idea. They were familiar with the concept after a few years. And so when the pandemic hit, there was interest in doing more to help business, to be more economically viable in our state. And then, the examples just run rampant, right? The number of government regulations that were suspended during the pandemic were numbering in the hundreds and thousands. And it became obvious that, hey, maybe we don't need these regulations. How could we make some of these deregulation bills permanent? And should we be looking at more regulatory reform in the future? So that was kind of the mindset that the legislature was in when our proposal came before them last year, last session. And so that's kind of why you had that bipartisan support. Because inevitably, this isn't the libertarian pipe dream we're talking about. We're not just, deregulating and getting rid of everything. That's not what this is. It's very much going within the process and using the regulatory model to create opportunities for deregulation. So it's very much working within the system, and I think that helps people that are a lot more moderate or even liberal in the American sense come to see the light on this particular issue and see that it could be something fruitful for our economy.
And well, for what I was reading, it works something like this. And please, correct me. For instance, you want to start some sort of business, or maybe start something within your company, and you can request the regulators to suspend or get an exemption of the current regulations for 2 years. Is that correct? And by the way, and what happens after those 2 years?
Yeah, so initially it's a year, and then you can get another year extension. And that's a fairly straightforward process in terms of now, I would say that all of this goes through a committee. So it's not just the regulator operating on their own, but there's a committee of business leaders and regulators who are looking at this and trying to facilitate this process and give their recommendations and kind of help the regulators along. It's very helpful that our governor was on board with this idea, because he's the one over all these executive agencies, and so they understand that this is something that they should participate in. And I think there's a lot of understanding that comes from this kind of stuff. I think a lot of regulators, they want to make it work without necessarily needing the sandbox. So this provides more pressure to do that. But once a company is in the sandbox, the idea is that there's constant review and data being collected the whole time. And so once they come out the other side, the idea is that that information is being presented back to the legislature for review and for proposed deregulation efforts. And so the idea is that after the 2 years, you might have the case where the legislature sees, hey, this has been a smashing success, this deregulation, this temporary suspension. Let's make it permanent. Or they understand, like, you know what, the old regulation doesn't work. Whether it's pounding a square peg into a round hole, or it's just an old regulation, or you're misapplying a new idea with an old industry. Whatever it might be, maybe we need a change. Maybe we need a different regulation. Maybe we need a reduced regulation. Whatever it is, and that can be proposed and passed. And so the idea is that we're trying to give the legislature enough time to make the changes necessary so that all companies can operate in that environment, and that these companies that have been in the sandbox can continue to operate outside of the sandbox. And we're just trying to take the time to figure out what makes sense. What we found a lot of times, because believe me, we've advocated for deregulation on a variety of things for years. And what we find is, without information, without data, legislators are just responding to anecdotal evidence about what might happen. And so the idea here is, well, let's stop with the conjecture. Let's stop assuming what might happen, the doomsday scenario. And, as long as we're protecting health, safety, and protecting against fraudulent activity, let's try it. And the idea also here is that if additional extensions are needed beyond 2 years, that's an option that the legislature might pursue in the future. We'll see how the program works and what makes sense.
In a way, let's say the sandbox works like it's two tests in one, because on the one hand is what you just mentioned a few seconds ago, that it's a way to test that this new product or service, let's say, is not going to provoke the end of the world or something like that. But on the other, and I think this is very interesting, as if I understood correctly how you put it, in fact, the sandbox is a test of the existing regulation and let's say and trying to assess how adequate to current times it is, and let's say, and how the regulation is working in relationships to those who want to regulate, and it's a magnificent lab to test that. Let's say that the ideal scenario would be that with this data, decision makers adjust, let's say, the scenario to what should be, what should happen, or how it should be.
Yeah, and inevitably, there's kind of two sides of the coin I see. We have highly regulated industries that have existed for hundreds of years, who are ripe for change. They need to come into the 21st century, or there's alternative ideas. And then there's the industries that you and I can't even think of currently. Things that people are going to think up, and as we see the exponential, curve of technology advancement, I think we're just going to see those things happen more and more. And we need a regulatory process that's ready for that. We can't just have everyone say, no, you can't do that. That's not possible.
Adam Thierer, a scholar from Mercatus, if I remember correctly, he says that if we are constantly planning for the worst case scenarios, we will end up missing a lot of best case scenarios.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, if we think about some of the great innovations that happened in the last 200 years, and think about, well, if we took those and plopped them down into the current regulatory environment, would we even be allowed to do that? Probably not. And that we'd miss out on a lot of the things that have created human flourishing in the 21st century, the things that have eliminated a lot of poverty, that have caused people's standard of living to increase by a wide margin. That's kind of the idea, is that as our society continues to grow and continues to advance, we need to allow those things to occur, because there's we all know there are problems to be solved in the world, and we need to be open to the innovators and the entrepreneurs who have the ideas to solve those problems.
When was your project, I think it's project 217, when was it approved? How long has been, let's say, in place?
So they're currently setting it up. So the legislature voted it in March. The governor would have signed it, and it would have technically gone into law in May. And currently, the program is being set up, and should launch at some point, before the end of the year.
So, I mean, it's unfortunately it's too soon to ask you for some, let's say, positive results about this, or at least have you seen, some, I don't know, business, new people or entrepreneurs thinking, hey, this will be a way, maybe I'll move my operations to Utah or something like that, some sort of, I don't know, hype in a way about it?
So the one thing we have to remember is there are, probably a dozen regulatory sandboxes operating around the U.S. currently. And so we have 3 in Utah, and the legal services sandbox has been doing awesome, especially with regards to providing low-income folks access to legal services, whether that be to expunge records or just to have access to legal advice, without having to pay huge amounts of dollars for it. So we have lots of companies operating in sandboxes around the country already. And we're seeing the success come from that. We're seeing people served. We're seeing lives being impacted. And so what we're waiting for is to move beyond legal services, insurance, and fintech and cryptocurrency and blockchain. That's what we're trying to move beyond those industries and see what other cool things people can come up with.
Michael, before letting you go, even though I would be talking about these things for a long time, and again, thanking you for your time and being so generous to take this interview, I wanted to ask you two final questions about different topics, some things that I believe are in your interests as well. I saw on the Libertas Institute website that last year, last year or beginning of this year, you wrote an article about education and certain changes that might have been probably boosted or speed up by COVID. And I wanted to ask you about that. How do you see, let's say, education in the US, and what sort of innovations you think would be, would improve how kids and how even young people and all of us are being educated nowadays?
Well, the amount of kids who are now being homeschooled or being put in micro schools or pods or these kinds of things, I think has increased by a large amount. And I would say the biggest change that I've seen so far is parents just being more open to flexibility and alternatives for their child's education. They kind of got a front seat to what their child was doing when they were home and doing Zoom meetings and that kind of stuff. And so a lot of parents said, well, you know what, I don't want to. I don't want him to do this anymore, or I'd rather do something else, or or maybe they're more involved in the public school period. Maybe they're more involved with the teacher or the regulations that are going on at the school. There's a variety of ways that parents are now engaging, and I think inevitably, I think the science shows that. The number one thing that impacts a child's education, along with where they live and those kinds of things, is parental engagement. If your parent is engaged, you're much more likely to be well educated. If your parent's not engaged, then you're much more likely to end up dropping out. So just having parents be a lot more engaged has changed the system forever. But it's engaged parents who want to choose alternatives and want to figure out what's best for their child, um, and realize that being engaged does not mean that you're rich or that you have all this extra money to spend. Engagement comes from all demographics. And we as a society need to pursue the policies which help all of those different demographics engage in those alternatives as they choose.
Yeah, and to wrap up the interview, I saw on your LinkedIn profile that you are interested in Austrian economics. Fundación Internacional Bases is a member of Somos Innovación, our pro-innovation network, and we just, with Fundación Bases, we just had our 10th International Austrian Economics Conference in Vienna, in Austria, which is a little bit like, going to the mothership. It was
Mecca.
Exactly, yeah. And this is the second time we do it in Austria. All the other editions have been in Argentina, which is Latin America. There's a lot of interest in Austrian economics. So I would like to ask you, what drove you towards Austrian economics? How you see Austrian economics today, in the sense, do you see it as probably as the best toolbox to try to understand our current economic realities?
Well, I was originally drawn to Austrian economics through Ron Paul here in the United States. And it really helped me start to think differently about economics. One of the things that I found troubling in college was I felt like you initially get taught Econ 110 or 101 or whatever it is, and they teach you all these basic good economic principles. And then they basically spend the rest of the time, all the rest of the economics courses, trying to use math and calculus to disprove basically everything that you learned and why that doesn't really make sense. And, we should actually manipulate the economy as much as possible. And that was just always confusing to me. And And inevitably, I feel like, for me, I loved reading Human Action from Mises, and for me, I was taught that you can't boil human actions, which are many, down to math. You can't just use calculus, multivariable calculus, to figure out, oh, well, if we do this to the economy and then this and then this, and then this will happen. Like, that's not how it works. You cannot control humanity in that way. Our economy is far too complex, far too big. And so macroeconomics to me is almost folly. But what we can do is study human behavior, study the microeconomies, study how a business operates, how a household chooses to spend its money, and kind of look at these different demographics and make some adjustments and understanding about how the world works. And so that's why for me, I want to give people the benefit of the doubt and the ability to choose, and that in the end, a lot of what people perceive as negative in this world, they think of greed and the pursuit of wealth and other things as negatives. And for me, it's like, no, that's just a subset of people's uneasiness. We are always striving to achieve more. Whether that be in our income, in our relationships, in our habits, in our pursuits, we are always uneasy. We are always trying to do more. And what a lot of people don't realize is that that uneasiness may drive us to pursue less. It's not always about more and consumption and this and that. In the end, people's uneasiness will drive them to achieve something within their own mental state, within their own being, to become the best human that they can be.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure talking to you. If you allow me, I'll just switch to Spanish to wrap up the episode. A todos quienes nos escucharon, les agradecemos mucho. Por favor, no olviden suscribirse en cualquier plataforma que usen para escuchar podcasts. Y nos encontramos en el próximo episodio de Sí, el podcast de Somos Innovación.
Sí es el podcast de Somos Innovación. Visita somosinnovación.lat para suscribirte. Y no olvides compartir este episodio a través de tus redes.